Excel Tutorial 5, pages 307 through 312. At the top of page 307, to apply the pivot style medium 10 style to the pivot table, make sure the active cell is in the pivot table. So you can click any place in the pivot table. On the ribbon, click the Pivot Table Tools Design tab. Pivot Table Tools Design. In the Pivot Table Styles group, click the More button. Pivot Table Styles, More. That opens the Pivot Table Styles gallery. Move the pointer over each style to see a live preview of the pivot table report with that style. Oh, that's lovely, like mustard. Okay, so just kind of look through them. Step 5. Click the Pivot Style Medium 10 style. That's the third style in the second row of the medium section. Okay, Pivot Style Medium 10. Again, third style, second row, medium section. Just click on it. Now the style is applied to the pivot table. To format the amount field in the pivot table as currency, in the values area of the pivot table fields, okay, remember your pivot table fields are over here. Down here you see filters, columns, rows, and values. So we're in the values area of the pivot table fields. Click the Value Field Settings button. Okay, Value Field Settings button. Okay, so we click on Sum of Amount and then Value Field Settings. That opens a shortcut menu. The Value Field Settings dialog box opens. Okay, Value Field Settings. Take a look at the figure 5-39 and you can see it. Step number 3, in the custom name box right there, type total cash receipts. Okay, got it? That's the label for the field. You will leave the sum as the summary function for the field. However, you could select a different function. Step number 4, click the Number Format button right there. The Format Cells dialog box opens. This is the same dialog box you've used before to format numbers in worksheet cells. Flip to page 308. In the category box, click Currency. You will use the default number of decimal places, currency symbol, and negative number format. Okay, so we're just going to click on Currency, and then you're going to leave everything else with the defaults. Click the OK button. The numbers in the pivot table will be formatted as currency with 2 decimal places. Okay, click the OK button again. The Value Field Setting dialog box closes, the pivot table changes to reflect the labels you entered, and the number format for the field changes to currency. Okay, do you see all the changes? All right, read real quickly about filtering a pivot table and adding a field to the filters area. On 308, to add the week number field to the filters area. In the pivot table fields pane, it's over here, drag the week number button from the rows area to the filters area. Okay, the week number button is right here. It's down here in our rows area. So you're going to get that 4-headed arrow and you're going to drag it up and drop it into filters. Okay? By default, the filter field items show all to indicate that the pivot table displays all the summarized data associated with the week number field. It's right here. Okay, so we have week number, it says all. Take a look at figure 5-40 on the bottom of page 308. Okay, they have everything labeled for you, so it's really important that you understand how this works and what we're moving and why. Next, you'll filter the summarized reports to show only cash receipts for week 2. All right, in cell B1, which is right here, click the filter button right there. The filter menu opens, showing the field items displayed. In the filter menu, click 2 and then click the OK button. Okay, so 2 and OK. The pivot table displays the total amount of cash receipts for the dates in week 2. The filter button changes to indicate the pivot table is currently filtered. Okay, right there. Remember, you have to learn how to read those filter buttons. take a look at figure 5-41 and make sure that your screen looks just like that figure. Filtering pivot table fields. Real quick little paragraph to read. To filter GIFs from the segment column labels. In the pivot table, click the Column Labels Filter button. Okay? Column Labels Filter button. The filter menu opens, listing the items in the segment field. 2. Click the GIFs checkbox to remove the check mark. The Select All checkbox is filled with black, indicating that all items are not selected. Click the OK button. The GIFs column is removed from the pivot table. The pivot table includes only cash receipts from coffee, food, and specialty drinks. See figure 5-42 on the next page. You can show the hidden objects by clicking the Column Labels Filter button and checking the GIFs checkbox. Turn over to page 310. Creating a slicer to filter a pivot table. Okay, read that little quick paragraph. To add the week number slicer to the pivot table. On the ribbon, click the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab. Okay, Pivot Tools Analyze. In the filter group, click the Insert Slicer button. Filter group, Insert Slicer. The Insert Slicers dialog box opens, displaying a list of available pivot table fields. You can select any or all of the fields. Click the week number checkbox to insert a check mark and then click OK. The week number slicer appears on the worksheet because the pivot table is already filtered to display only results from week 2. The 2 button is selected. The other slicer buttons are white because those weeks have been filtered and are not part of the table. Okay, so we want week number and OK. And here's our slicer. And as you can see, the number 2 is the only one that's currently selected. Okay, make sure that your slicer is selected. Remember, you just click on a white area to select it and make sure that you have the sizing handles all the way around it to indicate that it's active. Step 5. On the Slicer Tools Option tab, okay, Slicer Tools Options tab, in the Size group, here's our size group right here, change the height to 2.2 and the width to 1. Okay, so we want this to be 2.2. We want that to be 1. Okay, and as you can see, we change the size of our slicer. The slicer object is resized, eliminating the extra space below the buttons and to the right of the labels. The top of page 311. Make sure your slicer is selected. In the Slicer Styles group, click the More button. Okay, here's our slicer styles. There's More. Then click Slicer Styles Dark 2. Okay, so in our dark section, I'm assuming it's going to be this orange one. There it is, Slicer Style Dark 2. Click it. The slicer colors now match the pivot table. Drag the week number slicer to the right of the pivot table, placing its upper left corner in cell G3. Upper left corner in cell G3. Okay, remember to move your slicer. Just grab it in an area like that, top or bottom. Get a 4-pronged arrow, 4 black arrows like that, and you can move it. Take a look at figure 4-43 and compare that to your screen, and they should look the same. All right, to filter the pivot table using the week number slicer, press and hold the Control key and click the number 3 button and then let go. So Control 3, let go. So now both week 2 and 3 are selected. Press and hold the Control key and click the 4 and then the 5. Control, 4, 5, let go. Okay, now data for weeks 4 and 5 is added to the pivot table. Click the week 2 slicer button. Only the cash receipts for week 2 will then be displayed. Okay, do you see how that works? All right, on the bottom of 311, to hide the pivot table fields pane and rename the pivot table and worksheet, click in the pivot table to display the pivot table tools contextual tabs on the ribbon. So you just click into your pivot table, and here comes your pivot table tools contextual tabs on your ribbon. Click the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab. In the Show group, that's right there, click the Field List button. The pivot table field pane is hidden and won't reappear when a cell in the pivot table is selected. Flip over to page 312. In the pivot table group, select the default name in the pivot table name box and type Weekly Summary. Okay? So in the pivot table group, here's the name of our pivot table, and we are going to name it Weekly Summary. Please ensure that you do not use any spaces. And watch your spelling. Watch your enter key. Now, rename the worksheet as Weekly Summary Pivot Table. Pivot table is 2 words. Press your enter key to make it selected. Okay, one of the things you definitely need to read about is refreshing a pivot table, because in Excel we're used to everything automatically updating when we make a change. It doesn't quite work that way with pivot tables, so please ensure that you do read that, because you do have to refresh it to get it to update. All right, to update the January data table and refresh the pivot table, go to the Cash Receipts worksheet, Cash Receipts worksheet, and then find the food cash receipts for the food cash receipts for 1/4/2016. The amount is $309.66. Okay, so we're going to do a Control F, right? And what's the date we're looking for? 1/4. Find next. And find next. That's it, $309.66 right there. And yes, I know that you could have just looked at that and seen it. However, it's important that you learn to use that find and replace dialog box, so that when you have an extremely large table, you know how to do it, because going and hunting through thousands and thousands of rows of data just isn't realistic. So make sure you know Control F and then to enter your information and go, and you can find it really quickly. All right, click the records amount cell, and then you're going to change it to $409.66. So right now it's $309.66, and it should have been $409.66. Okay? The receipts amount is updated in the table. You'll return to the pivot table report to see the effect of this change. Go to the Weekly Summary Pivot Table worksheet. The amount for food on 1/4/2016 is still $309.66. Okay, right there, $309.66. The grand total for food is still $1,510.20. The grand total for 1/4/2016 is still $659.70, and the overall grand total is still $4,779.44. The pivot table was not automatically updated when the data in its source table changed. You need to refresh the pivot table yourself. Okay, click on any cell in the pivot table. On the ribbon, click the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab. In the data group, click the Refresh button. The pivot table report is updated. The totals are now $409.66, right there. 1610.20, $759.70, and the grand total is $4,879.44. Okay, and I'm sorry I didn't show you this one over here, which is right there. So we refreshed it, it's all set. Please remember that your pivot tables do not automatically update like everything else in Excel does, and you have to do that yourself by going to the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab and going to the data group and hitting refresh. That's the end of this video, and you're ready to move on to our last video.